A gondolier whispers secrets in the dark canals of Venice, secrets that kill. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Share where you're listening from. I love reading every one of your comments. Let's begin. The rain had been falling for hours. Its steady patter against the windowsill echoed in the dim, quiet apartment, mixing with the occasional clink of porcelain as Madame Maigret set down her cup. The grey morning stretched itself lazily into noon, the kind of day that wrapped Paris in an indifferent fog. The streets were soft with the damp, the air thick with a lingering mist. Inside their small but comfortable apartment, Chief Inspector Jules Amédée François Maigret stood by the window, watching the water run down the glass, his gaze distant, unfocused. It was a rare moment of peace, these brief intervals between cases, when his mind could wander, rather than being tethered to the constant tension of a new investigation. The brief respite, however, was always fleeting. He would find himself inevitably back in the streets of Paris, amongst the silent witnesses of human frailty and hidden truths. Madame Maigret sat at the table, her quiet presence soothing, though both were accustomed to this silence. They had been married for many years, and in their union, words were often unnecessary. He appreciated her patience, especially on days when his thoughts were elsewhere, as they often were. "Jules," she said softly, her voice carrying that unspoken understanding of her husband's mood. "Would you like me to bring you something to eat?" He didn't respond immediately, but turned his attention to her, his face etched with the familiar weariness of a man who had seen too much, known too much, and spoken too little. He was always in motion, but rarely did he feel still. "Just some coffee, Henriette," he said after a moment, his deep voice thick with the fatigue of the last few weeks. "Perhaps later we can take a walk in the Luxembourg Gardens. I could use the fresh air." Henriette nodded, rising to fetch the coffee. As she moved around the kitchen, Maigret turned back to the window, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched a lone figure move across the street below, disappearing into the fog that seemed to swallow the city whole. There was something about the figure that caught his attention, though he couldn't quite place it. Something in the way they moved, as if they were trying not to be noticed, or perhaps they simply didn't belong. A faint chime rang from the telephone in the hall, cutting through the quiet. Maigret's shoulders stiffened, a slight frown crossing his face. He knew that the peace would not last, not in his line of work. The city was never truly silent. It only took a moment for something to shift, for something to rise in the quiet. That had always been there, waiting. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if reluctant to break from the moment. He walked to the phone, picking it up with an almost languid grace. "Maigret," he said, his voice steady, calm, as if he had already anticipated the call. His eyes drifted back to the window, though the figure had long since vanished. "Inspector." "Maigret," the voice on the other end crackled. "We have a situation down at the Quai de la Tournelle. You might want to come take a look. It's peculiar." Maigret's fingers tightened around the receiver. "Peculiar." He could hear the hesitation in the officer's voice, the same hesitation that often accompanied matters that were never quite clear. "Yes, sir, a body has been found, but it's not the usual sort of thing, not exactly." Maigret's brow furrowed. "I'll be there shortly." He replaced the receiver with a soft click and turned toward the hallway, where Henriette was just finishing preparing the coffee. He nodded his thanks as he passed, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. She didn't need to ask. She knew that he was needed elsewhere. Outside, the rain had intensified, its pattering against the cobblestones growing louder. As Maigret made his way through the winding streets of Paris, the city was bathed in an almost spectral light, the buildings shrouded in mist, their outlines softened by the persistent drizzle. His coat, dark and well-worn, flapped slightly as he walked, his shoes making muted sounds on the damp pavement. The Quai de la Tournelle was a quiet stretch of the Seine, bordered by old buildings and quiet cafes, the kind of place where life moved at its own unhurried pace. But there was no calm now. When Maigret arrived, the small crowd gathered around the scene parted as he made his way to the riverbank. A few uniformed officers stood by, their faces tense. There, lying by the water, was a body. The man was young, no more than 30, and his clothes were neatly pressed, his shoes polished. His hands were folded across his chest in an almost serene pose, and yet There was something unnerving about it. His face was expressionless, the kind of stillness that made it seem as though he had been placed there rather than having died. There? What happened? Maigret asked, his voice low, his gaze studying the body with the quiet concentration he was known for. We don't know, sir. No sign of struggle, no marks to indicate violence. He was found early this morning, but there's something off about it. His eyes, they were open, but it looks as though he was looking at something just before he died, the officer explained. Maigret bent closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. The man's eyes seemed to be staring off into the distance, but not at anything in particular. It was the kind of look that unsettled Maigret. It wasn't fear, nor was it surprise. It was the look of someone caught between worlds, as though there was something important, something that was just out of reach. He wasn't alone, Maigret murmured to himself, his intuition already beginning to stir. There's more to this than a simple death. As the rain continued to fall around him, Maigret stood silently, the weight of the moment settling into him like a familiar ache. Something in the quiet of the scene tugged at him. The enigma of this young man, the way he was placed here by the river, the eyes that seemed to see something only he could understand. It was the start of something, but Maigret knew it would be no simple case. No. This was something different. The mystery of the whispering gondolier had just begun. The body was taken away with quiet efficiency, as though it were not the first of its kind to be found along the banks of the Seine. Maigret stood for a moment, longer, his coat collar turned up against the rain, his mind turning the scene over like a puzzle, each piece sliding into place just out of reach. There was something unnervingly deliberate about it. The way the man had been laid out, almost posed, it wasn't the sort of thing a drunken fall or a robbery gone wrong would explain. He turned toward the officer who had spoken earlier, the one who seemed particularly unnerved by the calmness of it all. Have you spoken to the people who found him? Maigret asked, his voice soft but direct. The officer nodded quickly. Yes, sir, it was a couple walking along the river early this morning. They said they heard something faint, like a voice, just before they spotted the body. But when they got closer, there was no one around. A voice? Maigret's interest piqued, but he kept his face neutral. Could they describe it? They said it was faint. Almost like a whisper, the officer said, visibly unsure of how much weight to give the statement. But they weren't sure if it was just the wind or something they imagined. A whisper. That was curious and not the kind of detail that could easily be explained away. Maigret's gaze shifted back to the river, where the mist hung low, the water flowing steadily, but with an almost unnatural stillness to it. It had been the whisper of something, perhaps a warning or a final message. Take me to where they found him, Maigret said after a moment. The officer led the way, stepping lightly over the cobblestones, his boots squelching in the wetness of the streets. Maigret's mind was working, already pulling threads together, though they were not yet tied in any meaningful way. He noticed how the crowd had begun to disperse, the usual curiosity waning as the officers took control of the scene. A few bystanders lingered, exchanging hushed words, their faces tired from the early morning wake-up call of tragedy. The officer stopped a few steps from where the body had been discovered, his hand gesturing toward the spot, now marked off with a few hastily placed barriers. They found him just here under the old willow tree, the officer explained. The tree's long dripping branches cast shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the dim light, as though they were part of the mystery themselves. But there was nothing unusual. No blood, no sign of struggle. Just him. Maigret. Crouched down by the base of the tree, his eyes scanning the ground. The grass was wet, as was everything else, but nothing appeared disturbed. No footprints, no sign of someone having left in a hurry. He rose slowly, considering the silence of the scene. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. I want to speak with the couple who found him, Maigret said quietly. The officer nodded and moved off toward the edge of the riverbank, returning shortly with the couple in tow. They looked tired but composed, two ordinary Parisians who had been caught in something extraordinary. The man, whose name turned out to be Pierre, was in his early 30s, with an earnest face that appeared almost apologetic. His wife, Madeleine, was of a similar age, her pale blue coat clinging to her shoulders like a protective shield. They both seemed more disturbed by their encounter than either would admit, yet there was a certain calm about them, as though they had seen something they were still struggling to comprehend. "Madame, Monsieur," Maigret greeted them with a nod, his voice low but inviting. "Tell me, exactly what did you hear this morning? Anything out of the ordinary?" Pierre hesitated, glancing at Madeleine before answering. "It was very faint, Inspector. A voice, it seemed to come from near the river, but it was soft, like someone speaking just beyond earshot. We couldn't make out what it was saying." Madeleine added, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "We thought it might have been someone in trouble, but when we got closer we saw him, the man. He was just lying there, like he was asleep." "Did either of you recognize him?" Maigret asked, his gaze never leaving their faces. "No," Pierre replied quickly. "We've never seen him before." Madeleine's eyes darted away for a moment, and Maigret noticed her fingers gripping the edge of her coat tighter, as though seeking something to hold on to. It was a small gesture, but in the world of human observation it was telling. Something in her had been unsettled by the sight of the man, perhaps even before she knew what she had found. Maigret's eyes lingered on her, but he said nothing. Instead, he let the silence stretch, waiting for the subtle clues to emerge, and after a long moment he asked, "Did you hear anything else? Any noise, any words?" Pierre shook his head, but Madeleine, her lips pressed together, seemed to struggle with something. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a sound," she said quietly, "but it wasn't from a Simenon. It came from the water, like something being dragged along the surface." Maigret's attention sharpened, though he kept his demeanor calm. "Something being dragged?" he repeated. "Yes," Madeleine nodded. "Not loud, but a soft scraping, just before we saw him." Maigret felt a pulse of cold realization. A whispering gondolier. It wasn't just a description, it was a hint, an instinctual trigger in his mind that something was amiss beneath the surface of this case. "Thank you," Maigret said, his tone dismissive but polite, signaling that the conversation was over. As they turned to leave, he turned his attention back to the water. It had been a quiet morning, too quiet. Something was lurking beneath the placid surface of the Seine, something that would soon reveal itself. But for now, Maigret could only wait. The city had secrets to share, and he would listen until they spoke. Maigret stood at the edge of the Seine, his eyes tracing the slow movement of the water, his mind turning over the new details that had come to light. A whisper. Something being dragged beneath the surface. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they didn't make a complete picture yet. His instinct told him this wasn't just another ordinary death, but something deeper, something that required more than the usual approach. He glanced at the officer who had accompanied him, a young man with a nervous edge to him. "Have you informed the coroner?" Maigret asked, his voice steady but sharp. "Of course, sir, they're on their way. We've already taken the body to the morgue." Maigret nodded. "Good. Make sure they don't rush their examination. We need to know everything, no matter how insignificant it may seem. And keep an eye on the surrounding area. I want to know if anyone has been seen near the riverbank recently." The officer acknowledged with a quick nod and moved off, his boots clicking against the wet pavement. Maigret remained standing for a while longer, his thoughts quiet as the rain continued to fall in sheets, softening the world around him. It was as if the city itself was shrouded in a thick veil, hiding things from view. But Maigret knew better than to rely on the surface of things. When he returned to his office, the usual bustle of Paris had resumed. The city was waking from its morning haze, indifferent to the death that had just occurred. Inside the precinct, the dull hum of voices filled the space as officers moved about their tasks. Maigret, however, found it hard to focus on anything but the whispers of the case. He sat behind his desk, his eyes staring out of the window, though he wasn't really seeing anything. His mind was elsewhere. He was interrupted by the sharp rapping of a knock at the door. He turned his head, only slightly, as the door opened. It was the same officer who had been at the riverbank earlier. "Sir, the coroner's report is in. They've finished with the body." Maigret's heart gave a small jolt, though he masked it with a calm nod. "Tell me everything." The officer stepped inside and handed Maigret the coroner's report. He read through it quickly, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the details. The man had died from asphyxiation, though the cause wasn't clear yet. There were no visible marks. No signs of struggle, no injury of any kind. The body had been well cared for, dressed neatly, and in no state of disarray. And yet there was something else, something buried in the fine print. There were traces of mud in his shoes, the officer added, noticing Maigret's silence. Not from the area around the riverbank. It's from somewhere farther inland. Maigret muttered, tapping the edge of the report thoughtfully. The evidence pointed toward a careful placement, a deliberate act rather than an accident or a random crime. The man had been brought there, placed in that exact spot, with care taken to avoid any sign of a struggle. And the mud was new information, one that suggested a location beyond the immediate surroundings. "Find out where this mud could have come from," Maigret ordered, his tone firm, "and speak to the couple again. I want to know more about what they heard, especially about that whisper. Was it just a coincidence, or was it something more?" The officer nodded and left, his footsteps quick as he disappeared down the hall. Maigret leaned back in his chair, his mind still on the strange clues that had begun to surface. The whispering. Gondolier, the faint sound of something being dragged, and now the mud from a distant place. There was something else at work here, something more subtle than simple murder. It was as though the man had been brought to Paris not by chance, but by necessity. After some time, the officer returned with fresh information. The mud had been traced to a small area near the old docks, a place known for its decaying piers and abandoned warehouses. It was a far cry from the picturesque scenes along the Seine, a place where life had long ago retreated. It was also, Maigret knew, a place where secrets festered. "The docks," Maigret murmured. "It makes sense. We need to go there. Now." The officer hesitated for a moment, but followed without question. They made their way quickly to the docks, the streets slick with the rain. As they neared the area, the city seemed to change. The noise of Paris faded, replaced by a silence that felt more oppressive than the steady fall of rain. The docks were abandoned, the wharves silent save for the occasional creak of wood in the wind. Maigret moved toward one of the old piers, his eyes scanning the ground for any clue, anything that might lead them closer to the truth. The mud was fresh here, but it seemed to stop abruptly as though something or someone had gone to great lengths to avoid leaving a trail. There were no signs of life here, no footfalls that suggested the area had been recently used. But then Maigret's eyes caught something, a faint impression in the wet earth, barely noticeable unless one knew where to look. It was a shape, almost like a footprint, but too vague to be certain. He knelt down, brushing the mud aside with his fingers, revealing a small crumpled piece of paper wedged between the planks. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a few hastily scrawled words. They were barely legible, smeared by water and time, but there was no mistaking the name, Gondolier. The word seemed to pulse in Maigret's mind. The whispering Gondolier. The clue had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. He stood up, his mind racing. The puzzle was coming together, but there was still a long way to go. The Gondolier, a name tied to something deeper, something connected to the man by the river. There was a story here, and Maigret would uncover it, slowly but surely, until all the pieces were in place. As the rain continued to fall, Maigret's resolve hardened. The game was afoot, and there would be no turning back now. Maigret stood in the shadow of the decaying pier, the damp air heavy with the scent of salt water and rot. The faint words scribbled on the crumpled piece of paper were still echoing in his mind. Gondolier. The name was nothing new to him. It conjured up images of the quiet, persistent figures who moved silently across the canals of Venice, often shrouded in mystery. But it felt strangely out of place here, by the Seine. He looked down at the piece of paper in his hand once more, his fingers turning it over slowly, as if expecting more to reveal itself. There was nothing else, just the word, barely legible, and the faint impression of mud marking its edges. As his mind worked through the possibilities, a new thought surfaced, one that struck him like a bell tolling at the back of his mind. The man in the river, the one found so carefully laid out, had been the key to something more. And now, with this clue in hand, Maigret could feel the stirrings of a deeper truth beneath the surface of the case. "Where do you think it came?" "From?" the officer asked, his voice tentative, interrupting Maigret's reverie. Maigret straightened, folding the paper carefully before slipping it into his coat pocket. "It's a name, an association. But it's not enough yet." The officer nodded, clearly unsure, but Maigret could see the wheels turning in his head. It was clear to him now that they were dealing with a case that wouldn't yield its secrets easily. It had taken time, but Maigret had learned to trust his gut, and his gut told him that the name on that paper, though it seemed almost trivial, had meaning. It was the one thing that had escaped the man in the river's carefully arranged story. "You need to find out more about the Gondolier," Maigret said finally, his voice low but firm. "Not just the name. Everything about it. Who uses that title in Paris, and what ties it to the docks?" The officer gave a quick nod, eager to assist, and, after a few more instructions, he hurried off toward the nearest police station to gather information. Maigret, meanwhile, stood still, watching the slow flow of the Seine, his thoughts wandering. The Gondolier. It felt like a shadow, always just out of reach. But Maigret had learned long ago that shadows didn't hide for no reason. They were waiting for something, or someone. He returned to the precinct after a time, the heavy rain still falling, but the bustle of the city no longer seemed to concern him. Inside, the office was alive with activity, officers speaking in low voices, paperwork shifting between hands. But Maigret's thoughts remained distant, still tracing the thread of the case. The paper, the word, the whisper, and they were all pieces. But what they would ultimately form, he couldn't yet see. His desk was waiting for him when he returned, though the pile of cases before him hardly seemed important now. He sat down, the familiar weight of the chair grounding him as he pulled out the report on the man from the river, once again going over it. The young man had no identification, no distinguishing marks, and no history to speak of. But he had been found in a place that suggested he had been more than just a random casualty. He'd been laid there, carefully arranged, almost reverently. A ritual, perhaps, or something more personal. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk as he thought back to the couple who had discovered the body. The whisper, the dragging sound in the water. He had asked them to return for another interview later, but he suspected they knew more than they had let on. People always did. It was in their nature. There was a knock at the door, breaking his concentration. "Come in," Maigret called out, his voice steady, though he already knew who it would be. The officer who had gone to track down information about the Gondolier. The officer stepped in, his face serious. "Inspector, I found something. It's not much, but it's a start." Maigret raised an eyebrow as the officer placed a folder on the desk. The officer opened it to reveal a few scattered documents, photographs of the riverbanks and an old yellowed map of Paris. "The Gondolier," the officer began, "isn't just a term used for the canal operators in Venice. There's a small but distinct group here in Paris. They're a sort of underground association. They operate mostly along the Seine, using small boats to ferry people across, or to transport goods under the cover of darkness." Maigret leaned forward, intrigued. This was new. "A smuggling operation, perhaps?" "Possibly," the officer said, flipping through the papers. "There's one man who's associated with this network. His name is Lucien Moreau. He's been known to frequent the docks near the Quai de la Tournelle, and some say he uses the name Gondolier for himself when he does business." "Moreau," Maigret repeated the name, his voice quiet. It was a name that tugged at the edges of his memory, but it wasn't enough yet. "Where does he operate from?" The officer glanced at the map and pointed to a small warehouse on the edge of the docks, near where the body had been found. "This is his usual spot. It's isolated, hard to reach unless you know how to navigate the back alleys of the river." Maigret stood, his mind racing. The pieces were aligning in a way that made too much sense. A smuggler, operating in the shadows of the city, and the man in the river had somehow been involved, perhaps as a victim, perhaps more. But one thing was clear. This was no random death. "Prepare a team," Maigret said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're going to the warehouse. I want to know everything about this Moreau. and I want it now." As he left the precinct, the rain had lightened to a steady drizzle, the streets now quiet in the aftermath of the morning storm. But Maigrè's mind was in motion, unraveling the threads of the case one by one. He had the name, he had the location. And soon he would have the truth. The warehouse was darker than Maigré had anticipated, its windows thick with grime, the smell of salt and rust hanging heavily in the air. The officer had been right. The place felt isolated, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The Seine, just beyond the narrow streets and broken docks, stretched like a silent witness to whatever had unfolded here. Maigré stood at the entrance, his hand resting on the doorframe as he surveyed the scene. The dim light from a nearby street lamp filtered through the gaps in the walls, casting faint shadows across the abandoned warehouse. There were no signs of life, no obvious movements, but something about the silence felt wrong. It was too perfect, too still. He motioned for the officers to follow. They moved in cautiously, their footsteps muffled against the old wood floor, their eyes scanning every corner. Maigré's focus remained sharp, his senses attuned to the smallest detail. The quiet felt like a lull before a storm. "Check every room," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "Look for anything that doesn't belong, anything out of place." As the officers began their search, Maigré's gaze drifted toward the far corner of the warehouse, where a stack of old crates and barrels sat piled together. There was something there, something that didn't belong in this forgotten place. It wasn't the crates nor the dust that clung to everything, but the faint outline of something hidden beneath the debris. He moved toward it slowly, his shoes scraping against the floorboards. As he approached, he noticed that the barrels seemed to be positioned carefully, almost as though they were guarding something. He crouched down and peered beneath them, revealing a small metal door that had been partially obscured by the stacked crates. The door was unremarkable at first glance, a rusted, unpainted thing that seemed as though it had been there for years. But there was something about it, something hidden in the way it had been concealed, that tugged at Maigré's curiosity. He stood up and motioned for one of the officers to come over. "Help me with this," Maigré said, his voice steady. "We need to see what's behind it." The officer moved to assist, and together they pushed the crates aside, revealing the door in full. The rusted metal creaked as Maigré turned the handle, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet space. When the door finally opened, it revealed a narrow, dimly lit passageway that stretched into the depths of the warehouse. The air inside felt different, cooler, and there was a faint smell of something organic. Stale water, perhaps, or damp earth. Maigré exchanged a glance with the officer before stepping inside. The passageway was tight, the walls closing in around them, but it led forward deeper into the hidden part of the warehouse. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing softly as they advanced. The corridor opened into a larger room, one that Maigré hadn't expected. It was a makeshift workshop of sorts, with a number of old discarded tools and equipment scattered around the floor. But it wasn't the tools that caught his attention. It was the small unmarked crates stacked in the corners, their contents hidden behind layers of thick black cloth. Maigré moved toward one of the crates and tugged the cloth away, revealing several smaller, neatly packed boxes inside. He carefully pried one open, and what he found made his heart skip a beat. It was a small wooden box covered in fine dust, but it was unmistakable. Inside were delicate glass vials, their contents, a deep, dark liquid. He reached for another box, pulling it open to reveal more of the same. Vials neatly organized, with no labels, no markings to indicate their contents. "Drugs," Maigré muttered under his breath, his mind racing. This wasn't just smuggling. It was a well-organized operation, one that had been hidden in plain sight, concealed beneath the veneer of legitimate business. The gondolier. It all made sense now. The man in the river, the cryptic whisper, the strange, dragging sound. This was no simple death. The man had been involved in something much larger, something sinister. "Sir," one of the officers said, his voice breaking through Maigré's thoughts, "you need to see this." Maigré turned, following the officer to the far side of the room. There, hidden in the shadows, was something that made his blood run cold. It was a small table, upon which sat an old battered ledger. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded in some places, but still legible. Maigret flipped it open carefully, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers and names. "These are records," Maigret murmured. "Shipping logs, payments, transactions, but—" What caught his eye was the name that appeared again and again in the ledger, Lucien Moreau. Lucien Moreau. Moreau's name was linked to every shipment, every transaction. It wasn't just the Gondolier title he used. He was the orchestrator of a massive smuggling ring, one that spanned much further than Maigret had initially thought. This wasn't about a single man or a single death. This was a network, and the man in the river had gotten too close to something dangerous. Maigret turned to the officer, his mind already moving ahead. "We need to find Moreau," he said, his voice decisive. "Now." As he left the warehouse, the pieces were coming together at last. But even as the officers filed out behind him, Maigret felt the weight of what was to come. The investigation had just begun, and there was much more to uncover, and far too many secrets still hidden beneath the surface. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the street, and for the first time in hours, Maigret felt the oppressive weight of the case lift just a little, but only a little. Moreau was out there somewhere, and Maigret had no intention of letting him slip through his fingers. Not this time. Not when the truth was so close. Maigret paced the narrow, rain-slick streets of Paris, the echoes of his footsteps absorbed by the wet pavement. The city had taken on a muted tone since the downpour had ceased, as though it too was waiting for something. Its buildings pressing inward, as though closing ranks in quiet anticipation. His mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle falling. Together, yet still out of his grasp, teasing him with the knowledge that something larger was unfolding just beneath the surface. His thoughts kept returning to the warehouse, to the hidden room, to the vials that had been carefully concealed in those crates. Drugs. The smuggling operation was vast, intricate. Maigret had seen enough cases like it to know that this wasn't just about profit. There were deeper, darker forces at play. The gondolier, the whisper, the dragging sound, everything connected in a way that wasn't immediately obvious, but it was beginning to take shape. He arrived at the station, the familiar hum of activity enveloping him as he walked through the door. Officers moved in and out of the building, speaking in low voices while others shuffled papers with an air of quiet urgency. But Maigret felt the weight of the case settle on him, each step heavier than the last. He had to act quickly. Lucien Moreau was still out there, and Maigret couldn't afford to lose him. He made his way to his office, where the officer he had sent earlier with the records was waiting. The officer stood when Maigret entered, his face tense with the kind of news that could change the course of the investigation. "Sir," the officer began, "we've found something." Maigret nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "What have you got?" The officer placed a thick envelope on the desk, his hand lingering on it for a moment before pulling back. "We've checked the name, Moreau. He's got connections everywhere. We've traced his transactions, but we found something else, something we didn't expect." Maigret opened the envelope and began flipping through the documents inside. As he scanned the pages, he felt the knot in his chest tighten. The records weren't just shipping logs. They were detailed, sophisticated. Moreau wasn't operating alone. He had ties to several prominent people in the city, businessmen, politicians, even law enforcement. The smuggling ring wasn't just an underground operation. It was embedded in the fabric of Paris itself. One name stood out in the documents: Jeanette Lambert, a well-known socialite and philanthropist who had used her charity events as a front for laundering money. Maigret's eyes narrowed. Lambert had been in the public eye for years, her influence undeniable. Her name being linked to Moreau was a game-changer. Jeanette Lambert, Maigret muttered under his breath. Her socialite, a philanthropist, and now a criminal. This changes everything. "Yes, sir," the officer replied, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It seems she's been helping Moreau with the transport side of things. There's a lot of money moving. Through her charity. We've had her under surveillance, but it seems like she's got everyone fooled." Maigret leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying the documents with renewed intensity. The scope of the operation was larger than he had imagined, but the connection to Lambert added another layer of complexity. It wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about power, about control, about the people who lived in the shadows and pulled the strings from behind closed doors. "We need to move quickly," Maigret said, his voice steady, though his mind was already racing ahead. "Find out where Lambert is, where she's staying. We can't afford to wait any longer." As the officer left to follow through on his instructions, Maigret allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. His thoughts turned to the man in the river again, the one who had started it all. The body had been carefully placed, a deliberate act meant to send a message. And Maigret now knew that the message wasn't just for him, it was for anyone who might get too close to the truth. The walls of the precinct seemed to close in as the hours passed. Maigret stayed at his desk, his eyes flicking between the case files, the records, the photographs of the warehouse, and the map of Paris that had started to look more like a labyrinth with every new revelation. The pieces were coming together, but they were also multiplying. What started as a simple death had spiraled into something far more dangerous. He was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. The officer returned, his expression tight. "We've located Lambert," he said. "She's at her estate just outside the city. We're preparing a team to bring her in." Maigret didn't hesitate. He stood up immediately, his mind focused. "Let's go. We need to move fast." The drive out of Paris was silent, the headlights cutting through the darkness as Maigret's thoughts circled back to Lambert. She was no ordinary criminal. Her influence, her ties to the upper echelons of society, she had everything to lose. Which meant she had everything to gain by keeping her secrets buried. The estate loomed ahead, an imposing building set against the darkened sky, its silhouette jagged against the flickering lights of the car. Maigret's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. It was too quiet, too perfect. There was no sign of movement, no indication that they had been anticipated. But Maigret knew better than to assume anything. They approached the house cautiously, the officers fanning out around the perimeter. Maigret felt the familiar tension in his chest. Lambert was a key piece of the puzzle, but she wasn't the only piece. Moreau was still out there, and the network he had built was still very much alive. As they reached the front door, Maigret felt a strange sense of anticipation settle over him, like the calm before a storm. He was about to step into the lion's den, and he knew that everything they had learned so far was just the beginning. There were more secrets to uncover, more lies to unravel. The door opened slowly, and Maigret stepped inside, his resolve hardening. Jeannette Lambert was about to face the consequences of her involvement, but Maigret knew it wouldn't end with her. The web of deception was far more intricate, and the truth, as always, would be far harder to find than anyone could imagine. The door creaked open as Maigret stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. The air in the mansion was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and dust, an unsettling combination that hinted at both wealth and neglect. The marble floors reflected the faint light from a chandelier above, its crystal prisms casting strange, fractured shadows across the walls. Maigret didn't need to look back to know the officers had spread out, securing the house. The estate had the feel of a place where secrets were hidden in every corner, and Maigret's instincts told him that Jeannette Lambert's carefully cultivated public persona was just that, carefully constructed. The woman who played the role of Parisian philanthropist had undoubtedly buried far more than just money beneath the surface of her charity work. He moved slowly down the hallway, his shoes clicking softly against the stone. The silence of the house seemed oppressive, almost deliberate. No one was here, or at least no one was making their presence known. The air felt thick with tension as Maigret approached a set of double doors at the end of the hall. His fingers brushed the cold brass handle, hesitating just for a moment before he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was grand, more of an opulent study than a typical sitting room. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents neatly arranged, though there was an almost excessive order to everything. A large desk sat in the center of the room, papers stacked neatly beside an ornate inkwell and fountain pen. But it wasn't the desk or the books that caught Maigret's attention. It was the woman who stood by the window, her back to him. Jeannette. Lambert turned as she heard the door open, her face betraying no shock or fear, only a cool, practiced composure. Her features were delicate, her posture perfect, and though she seemed to be in her late 40s, there was something ageless about her, the kind of beauty that came not from youth, but from a carefully maintained facade of grace and control. "Inspector Maigret, I presume?" she said, her voice smooth, with just the slightest trace of mockery. "I must admit I wasn't expecting. Company this evening?" Maigret studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I'm afraid your evening has taken a turn, Madame Lambert," he said, his tone even. "We need to speak about the operation you've been hiding." "You've been hiding." Her lips tightened slightly, but she gave no other sign of alarm. Instead, she straightened, her eyes flicking briefly to the window, as if considering an escape route. But then, with a soft sigh, she turned back toward Maigret, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her voice as calm and controlled as ever. "I have nothing to hide." Maigret didn't buy it. There was a careful calculation in the way she spoke, the way she held herself, like someone who had learned long ago how to play the game. "Then you won't mind answering a few questions," he said, stepping farther into the room, his eyes scanning the surroundings, as if the very decor of the space might reveal something about the woman who inhabited it. Lambert tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she appraised him. "Questions? I don't see why I should answer. Anything at all without a proper explanation." Maigret moved to the desk, his hands resting on the edge as he leaned forward slightly. "You've been involved with Lucien Moreau, his smuggling ring, the drugs being transported through your charity. You've been facilitating the movement of goods in exchange for money. And now a man is dead. A man who was too close to your business." She remained still, but Maigret could see the subtle shift in her expression. It was almost imperceptible, a tightening around her eyes that betrayed a fleeting moment of concern. She recovered quickly, though, giving him a polite smile as if she were humoring him. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said. "This is all hearsay. I'm simply a woman who helps others, Inspector. My charity work is above reproach." "Above reproach?" Maigret echoed, his voice slightly sharper now. "It's a front, Madame Lambert, a convenient excuse to funnel money and goods. You've been covering up for Moreau's operation, and now you're involved in a murder." Lambert didn't flinch, but something in her eyes flickered. Was it fear, or something more? "If you believe I am guilty of something, then you must have evidence," she replied coolly. "You've been running a charity for years, yet the books don't add up. Donations don't match the actual expenditures, and those shipments, they don't just move themselves." Lambert stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "You're wasting your time, Inspector. This is all speculation. You have no proof." Maigret's gaze hardened. "And yet I have you. I have the money, the shipments, and a dead man in the river with a connection to you. I'm not leaving until I know the truth." The room fell silent, the tension thick between them. For a moment, neither moved. Then, with a deep breath, Lambert turned away, walking slowly to the window. She stared out at the darkened estate, grounds her back to Maigret as she gathered her thoughts. "I've lived my life for appearances, Inspector," she said, her voice softer now, though still controlled. "I've done what I had to do to survive, but this is different. Moreau—" She trailed off, her hands gripping the edge of the windowsill, her knuckles white. "I didn't want any of this, but when you're in his web, it's hard to—" "Get out." Maigret stepped closer, his voice low. "You didn't just get tangled in Moreau's web, Madame Lambert. You helped weave it, and now someone's dead because of it." She didn't respond right away, but her shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I didn't want him dead. I never meant for any of this to happen." Maigret's eyes narrowed, studying her carefully. He could feel the shift in the room, the faintest tremor in her voice that suggested she wasn't as invulnerable as she appeared. But whether it was guilt, fear, or something else, he couldn't be sure yet. "Then tell me, Madame Lambert," he said quietly, "what did happen?" Lambert's eyes remained fixed on the view outside the window for a long moment, her hands still gripping the sill, her shoulders drawn tight with a tension that had begun to unravel at the edges. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost resigned, though there was still an edge of defiance in it. "Lucien Moreau is not a man you can simply walk away from, Inspector. He doesn't let people go. You don't refuse him without consequences." Maigret took a step closer, the weight of her words settling heavily in the room. You're saying you were forced into this? She turned slightly, her face partially illuminated by the dim light spilling from the window, casting shadows across her features. It wasn't like that at first. I didn't know the extent of his operation. I thought I could help people, give them a way out of their lives. I believed the money could be used for something good. I was naive. She paused, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, perhaps, or fear. But when I learned what Moreau was really doing, when I found out about the drugs, the people he was trafficking, it was already too late. I was in too deep. Maigret didn't respond immediately. He was listening carefully, watching the way she spoke, the way her body language seemed to fight against the vulnerability in her voice. He knew this wasn't a simple case of guilt. Lambert wasn't entirely a victim, but she wasn't entirely the mastermind either. There was something more here, a story buried under layers of manipulation, choice, and consequence. Who was the man in the river? He asked, his voice calm, measured as he watched her carefully. Why did he have to die? Lambert's gaze flickered away from Maigret for a brief moment, and then she turned fully to face him, her expression harder now. His name was Pierre Dufresne. He worked for Moreau, but he wasn't like the others. He had a conscience. He started to ask questions. Moreau doesn't tolerate that, not when things are going wrong. Maigret nodded slowly, piecing together the information. Dufresne was a threat to Moreau. He wanted out, and Moreau couldn't afford that. So he used you to clean it up. Her eyes tightened and her jaw clenched. He asked me to help him. With Dufresne. He said I could make it go away, that I could protect myself if I did. I thought it would be quick, easy. A few whispered words, a quiet removal. I never imagined it would turn into something like this. And what happened? Maigret pressed. Did you know he was going to end up in the river? Did you arrange for his death? Lambert shook her head sharply. No, I didn't want him dead. I thought I could convince Moreau to scare him, to let him go. I never thought it would go this far. Maigret's mind was already spinning the details. Lambert had gotten caught between Moreau's world and her own. But she wasn't just a passive participant. She had chosen to play a part in it. The truth was murkier than he'd expected. This wasn't a simple case of guilt or innocence. It was a tangled web of survival, manipulation, and fear. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the room once more. There were no obvious signs of resistance or struggle, no indication that she had been forced into this position against her will. She had made her choices, whether out of fear or ambition, and now the consequences were catching up with her. You're telling me that Moreau orchestrated everything, Maigret said, his voice steady. And you were simply a pawn in this? Lambert's face hardened again, her lips curling into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't say that. I may not have wanted Dufresne to die, but I didn't stop it either. Moreau wanted him gone. And in the end, I did what? He asked. You don't refuse Lucien Moreau, Inspector. He makes sure you understand that. Maigret's gaze hardened. But you knew enough to play a part in hiding the truth. You gave him the tools he needed to keep his operation running, to continue poisoning this city. There was a flicker of hesitation in Lambert's eyes, but she quickly masked it, her chin lifting as she met Maigret's stare. Yes, she said flatly, I knew. But you don't understand what it's like to be caught in his web. Once you're in, there's no way out. People like me don't have the luxury of making clean choices. Maigret's hand tightened into a fist at his side, but he kept his voice even. So you admit it. You were complicit in his operation. I didn't want to be, she said, almost as if she was convincing herself. I never wanted any of this. But the more I tried to get away from him, the more he tightened his grip. There was a long pause as Maigret absorbed her words. He could see the conflict in her, the internal struggle between guilt and fear, between wanting to escape and knowing there was no way out. But what she didn't seem to understand, what she refused to acknowledge, was that she had chosen to be part of something that was far beyond her control now. Moreau had made sure of that, with his smuggling, his manipulation, and his threats. I need to know everything about Moreau's operation, Maigret said, his voice quiet but insistent. Where he's hiding, who else is involved, everything. This is your chance to help yourself. For the first time there was a flicker of something other than fear or defiance in Lambert's eyes. It was uncertainty, and Maigret could see her weighing the cost of what he was asking. Her silence stretched between them, thick with tension. She opened her mouth to speak, then paused, as if the words were caught in her throat. "I don't know where he's hiding," she said finally, her voice small. "But I know who can help you find him." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Lambert's gaze flicked to the far corner of the room, and for a fleeting moment, there was something like fear in her eyes. "There's someone else, someone who's been helping him from the inside. Someone you won't expect." She hesitated, the weight of the secret heavy on her lips. "But you need to get to them before Moreau does." Lambert's words hung in the air, charged with a promise of something more, something that could shatter the entire case wide open. Maigret watched her carefully, the quiet tension in the room almost unbearable. She had hesitated, and the fear in her eyes wasn't lost on him. Whoever this person was, they were important. Moreau had someone on the inside, someone who could be the key to unraveling the entire operation. Who is this person? Maigret's voice was steady, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Tell me." For a moment, Lambert simply stood there, her hands pressed together tightly as though she was holding something back. Finally, she met his gaze, her face pale, her expression hardening. "I can't give you a name just like that," she said, her voice low. "If Moreau even suspects I've spoken about him, it's over, but I'll give you something that might lead you to them." Maigret leaned forward slightly, his attention never wavering. "Go on." Lambert took a breath, her lips trembling ever so slightly. "There's a meeting planned tomorrow night, a shipment. It's a regular transaction, one Moreau doesn't want any mistakes in. He'll be there in person." "And where is this meeting?" Maigret pressed, his mind already racing ahead, calculating the possible locations, the players involved. "Not a place you'd expect," Lambert said, her voice quieter now, almost as if speaking too loudly might draw attention. "It's a private club, disguised as something else, an upscale restaurant by day, a place for illicit deals by night. The owner's a former associate of Moreau's, someone who still has a debt to him. You can find him at Le Manoir d'Or, tucked away on Rue du Faubourg." Maigret's mind clicked into gear. Le Manoir d'Or. The name didn't ring any bells immediately, but the location sounded like the sort of place where shady dealings could easily be hidden behind a polished facade. The type of place where deals were made over champagne and secrets were exchanged under the soft glow of chandeliers. "And this person who can help me, where do they fit into this?" Maigret's voice was firm, insistent. He couldn't afford to let Lambert drift away from the topic. Lambert's eyes darted nervously toward the door, as if expecting someone to come barging in. She looked back at Maigret. "They'll be there. They have access and they know the truth. But you need to hurry. If you wait too long, Moreau will pull them out of the picture before you even get a chance to talk to them." The mention of them raised Maigret's suspicion. This wasn't just one informant, but someone involved in the depths of Moreau's operation. Someone important, someone with knowledge that could expose everything. He wasn't sure how much he could trust Lambert, but the urgency in her voice felt genuine, and there was no denying that her information was valuable. "I'll take care of it," Maigret said, his voice brokering no argument. He turned toward the door, his mind already working through the details of what needed to happen next. But then he stopped. "And you, Madame Lambert, what happens to you now?" Her face hardened again, the mask of the calm philanthropist slipping back into place. "I've given you what you need, Inspector. I've done my part. As for me..." She paused, almost as if weighing her words carefully. "I'll handle the consequences. But I've already lost more than I can afford to lose. I don't expect your help." There was a note of finality in her voice, a resignation that Maigret recognized. She had helped, but the lines had already been drawn. Whatever came next, it wasn't about redemption for her, it was survival. But he couldn't afford to linger on her fate now, not when there was still so much at stake. He left the mansion quickly, the night air biting against his skin, the weight of Lambert's revelation pressing heavily on his mind. Le Manoir d'Or. The name kept echoing in his thoughts as he made his way through the quiet streets of Paris, his steps purposeful. The closer he got to the address Lambert had given him, the more the city seemed to shift around him. The bustling noises of the evening faded, and the shadows grew longer, as if hiding the secrets of the city's underbelly. Maigret had been in Paris long enough to know how its quiet corners could hold the darkest truths. He wasn't sure what he would find at Le Manoir d'Or, but he knew it was the key to everything. As he approached Rue du Faubourg, the narrow street seemed to be just another ordinary Parisian road, lined with shops and apartments. But Maigret could sense the subtle shift, the undercurrent of something hidden beneath the polished veneer of the neighborhood. It didn't take long to spot the restaurant, a large, elegant building with tall windows that glinted in the dim light. It looked the part, expensive, sophisticated, a place where the city's elite could hide in plain sight. Maigret stepped inside without hesitation. The interior of Le Manoir d'Or was, as expected, opulent, with rich velvet curtains, chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and a low murmur of conversation from the well-dressed patrons scattered throughout the space. The air smelled of fine food, of wine, of something more, something he couldn't quite place, but something that reminded him of the quiet deception that thrived in places like this. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the meeting Lambert had warned him about. And then, at the far end of the room, he saw it. A small private table tucked away in the corner, guarded by two men who didn't belong in the setting. They looked out of place, too rigid, too watchful. Maigret's instincts were sharp. This was it. This was the meeting that would give him the answers he needed. He moved slowly toward the table, keeping his steps even, his eyes fixed on the men. They hadn't noticed him yet, and that gave him a slight edge. But it wouldn't last long. As he neared the table, he recognized one of the men sitting at it, Lucien Moreau. He hadn't expected him to be here, but the sight of him confirmed everything. The web was real, and Moreau was the spider at its center. Maigret's fingers tightened around the edge of his coat as he prepared to make his move. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that would either end the case or send it spiraling into deeper, more dangerous territory. Maigret approached the table with deliberate steps, keeping his posture casual, blending in with the ambient luxury of the restaurant. Moreau was easy to spot, his features sharp, his dark eyes calculating. He sat with an air of familiarity, a man in control, the kind of man who knew the power of silence in a room like this. The two bodyguards by his side were alert, but relaxed, their attention divided between the surrounding guests and the conversation at the table. Maigret's eyes flickered to the two men. They were not the usual thugs that one might expect to see in an operation like Moreau's. These men were polished, professional. They fit seamlessly into the opulent setting, their presence almost unnoticed by the other diners. They were there for protection, but Maigret knew better than to assume that meant they were mere bodyguards. Moreau noticed him before Maigret had reached the table completely. There was no surprise in the man's expression, just a slight tightening around his lips, as if he had been expecting Maigret's arrival for some time. "Inspector Maigret," Moreau said smoothly, his voice like velvet, the kind of voice that never raised in volume but commanded attention. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking." Maigret stopped at the edge of the table, his eyes meeting Moreau's with equal intensity. "I wasn't sure I'd find you here, Mr. Moreau," he replied evenly, his gaze flicking over the table to the two men with him. "This is an unexpected setting for a meeting about illegal shipments." Moreau's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The world is changing, Inspector. Why wouldn't we do business in places like this? People like to think of these restaurants as safe havens, but they are just as easily the perfect places to hide in plain sight." Maigret's eyes narrowed slightly, the words hanging between them like a trap ready to spring. "Moreau," he began, his voice quiet but with a sharp edge, "I don't care for the games. I'm here to end this, to expose your operation for what it is. It's only a matter of time before the whole city knows about your little network." Moreau didn't flinch. He simply nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tapping the edge of his glass. "You're persistent, I'll give you that, but persistence doesn't always bring results. You've been poking around in places that don't concern you, Inspector. You've been asking questions you shouldn't." Maigret felt the tension tighten in the air, his pulse steady but his instincts on high alert. Moreau was toying with him, and he could sense the weight of whatever game was about to unfold. He needed to be careful. The smuggler wasn't just a criminal. He was a master manipulator, someone who could dismantle Maigrè's every move if he wasn't cautious. "Let's be honest," Maigré said, leaning slightly closer, his voice low and controlled. "This is bigger than you, Moreau. You may think you're untouchable, but I'm not here to make deals. I'm here to finish this." The room seemed to grow quieter as Moreau studied Maigré. The smile finally reached his eyes, but it wasn't one of warmth. "You think you're in control, but you're just one player in a much larger game. Do you know how much power is in this city, Inspector? You think the authorities don't know what's happening. They do, but they turn a blind eye because they're part of the system too." Maigré kept his gaze steady, unfazed by the words. "And how much longer do you think that will last?" he asked. "How much longer can you operate without people like me catching?" "Son, the web you've spun is falling apart, Moreau. You're the one who's trapped now." Moreau's eyes flickered with something more dangerous, annoyance perhaps, or a flash of genuine fear. He quickly masked it with a cold, calculating smile. "You've been playing in my shadows for too long, Maigré. You're about to learn that the truth is more complicated than you think." Before Maigré could respond, the door to the private room opened, and one of the bodyguards stepped in, his expression tense. Moreau's face darkened instantly, the smile slipping away. "Is there a problem?" Moreau asked, his voice tight, though he tried to mask it with feigned indifference. The bodyguard's voice was low as he leaned in, speaking only for Moreau to hear. Maigré, ever the observer, caught the flash of something passing between them. Something was happening, something that didn't sit right. Moreau's demeanor shifted immediately, his eyes narrowing, and he turned back to Maigré with renewed intensity. "You're not the only one who has interests in this game, Inspector. People like you are easy to dismiss, but those who really pull the strings don't show their faces. You're not dealing with small-time criminals anymore." Maigré's mind clicked into place. The insinuation was clear. There were others, people far more powerful than Moreau, pulling the strings from the shadows. The smuggler was merely a middleman, a pawn. "Who are these people, Moreau?" Maigré asked, his voice low but steady. "Who's really behind all of this?" For a moment Moreau said nothing. Then, with an air of finality, he leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply, as though burdened by the weight of a secret too heavy to bear. "You don't get it, do you, Maigré?" he said quietly. "The people you're chasing don't care about you. They're above this, they're untouchable. You're wasting your time thinking you can expose them." Moreau stood, his eyes flicking to the bodyguard who had entered earlier. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men exchanged a silent understanding. Maigré's hand instinctively reached for his coat, preparing himself for what might come next. "Consider this your last warning, Inspector," Moreau said coldly. "You're not in control here." Before Maigré could respond, the bodyguard moved toward him with alarming speed. But Maigré was quicker. He stepped back already, anticipating the move, and in a single motion, he had his hand on the gun tucked into his coat, a standoff. Neither side willing to give in. Then unexpectedly a voice from the doorway broke the tense silence. "That's enough, Lucien." A new figure stepped into the room. A woman. Maigré's eyes widened in recognition. It was Jeanette Lambert. But this time there was no mask of calm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I told you not to trust anyone," she whispered urgently, her voice shaking. "Get out of here, now." The words hung in the air like a warning, and in that moment Maigré knew that everything was about to change. Moreau's operation was not just criminal, it was political. The people behind it were untouchable, and Maigré had just uncovered a piece of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. Maigré's eyes never left Lambert as she stepped further into the room, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed a strand of hair away from her face. The words she had spoken, the warning, hung between them, an urgent plea that couldn't be ignored. For a moment, Maigré saw her as something more than the woman who had been caught in Moreau's web. There was fear in her eyes now, but it was not the fear of a woman caught in her own lies. It was the fear of someone who knew she was on the verge of something far worse. Moreau, on the other hand, seemed strangely composed in the face of Lambert's intervention. his cold demeanor never wavering. He stood there motionless, as if calculating how best to handle the situation. His bodyguard hovered nearby, but no one made a move just yet. The air was thick with tension, but Maigret knew better than to let it intimidate him. He had the upper hand now, or at least he believed he did. "Why are you helping me, Lambert?" Maigret asked, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of disbelief in his tone. "You've been part of this all along. Why warn me now?" Lambert's eyes darted toward Moreau for the briefest of seconds, then back to Maigret. "Because I'm out of options and so are you," she said, her voice strained. "This goes beyond Moreau, the people behind him. You'll never get to them. They own this city. They control everything. And the moment you dig too deep, you'll be buried alongside the rest of us." Maigret felt the weight of her words settle heavily in the pit of his stomach. He had known there was more to this than just Moreau, but hearing it laid bare, hearing the sheer depth of it, hit him with a force that was almost physical. She was right. The layers of corruption, the political ties, the wealth and power that protected people like Moreau, he had underestimated just how deep it ran. "I've already dug too deep," Maigret said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Moreau, who remained eerily calm. "And now I have a choice. I can either walk away, let you disappear into the shadows, or I can expose you for what you are." "What you are?" Moreau didn't flinch. "I think you know the truth already, Inspector. But truth is a fragile thing. People believe what they want to believe, and they'll never believe that someone like me is involved with someone like you. They'll sweep it under the rug, just like they've done with so many others." Lambert took a step forward, her eyes softening, and for the first time she seemed less like the polished socialite and more like a person who had been worn down by a life of choices she couldn't undo. "It's not just Moreau you need to worry about. It's the people who run the show, the ones who never get caught, who control everything from behind closed doors. And if you think you can change that, you're fooling yourself." Maigret remained silent, the weight of her words pressing on him, but his resolve didn't waver. He had spent his career chasing shadows, unraveling lies, and seeking out the hidden truths that people tried so desperately to bury. He wasn't about to stop now, no matter how far the web stretched. Suddenly the door to the room slammed open, and another figure appeared in the doorway. A man, tall, sharp-featured, and impeccably dressed. Someone Maigret hadn't expected. He wore the look of a man who had more power than most people could imagine, and his presence in this room was both an invitation and a threat. Maigret recognized him immediately, one of the city's most influential political figures, a man who had always managed to remain just out of reach of any scandal. "Inspector Maigret," the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I'm surprised to see you here. I was wondering when we'd cross paths." Maigret's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but seeing the man standing there confirmed everything. This was the power that pulled the strings. This was the man who had enabled Moreau's empire to thrive, who had kept the truth buried, who had ensured that no one ever ventured too far into the darkness. "And who might you be?" Maigret asked, though he already knew the answer. The man smiled, his expression cold and calculating. "You've been chasing the wrong shadow, Inspector. I'm the one you should be looking for." For a long moment, the room was silent. Maigret stood there, facing the political figure with the weight of all his suspicions confirmed. The man was untouchable, just as Lambert had warned, but the detective's mind was still racing. There was always something more beneath the surface, and Maigret wasn't about to let this man's calculated smile be the last word in this case. "I won't stop," Maigret said quietly, though the words were laced with resolve. "You may be untouchable now, but you won't be forever, and when this web unravels, I'll be there." The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough to show that Maigret had struck a nerve. "You're a stubborn man, Inspector, and in the end, your persistence will be your undoing." Maigret turned his attention back to Lambert, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and resolve. "You're still part of this, Lambert, but if you want a chance at redemption, you'll help me." She met his gaze, her eyes filled, with a mixture of guilt and fear, but there was something else now, a spark of defiance. "I don't have a choice anymore, do I?" she whispered. "We're all trapped in this, Maigret. But maybe it's time to burn it all down." For the first time, Lambert seemed to believe that she could escape. maybe not entirely clean, but with a chance to at least reveal the truth. It was small, but it was enough. Maigret turned his attention back to the political figure standing before him, the man who had been running the show from behind the curtains. "You won't win, no matter how many strings you pull," he said, his voice low and steady. "The truth always comes to light." The man laughed softly, a sound that echoed with both amusement and contempt. "We'll see, Inspector. We'll see." With that, Maigret stepped back, the realization settling over him like a weight. He had been right about one thing. This was bigger than any of them. But no matter how deep the conspiracy ran, Maigret knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over yet. And as the door closed behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The game was far from finished, and the shadows of Paris were waiting for him to uncover them all. Cover them all.